Hello, my name's Ian Hawkins. You're listening to The Y Word, the show that gets under the skin of people who've changed the world in some way to find out what makes them tick. Today's guest really has made a huge difference to life in the UK over the last 30 years. So hold on, it's going to be a great show, and coming up, you're going to hear this.
The issue here is equality. I don't care if the age of consent is 21, 34, I don't care if it's 68 as long as it is for everybody. You know, I used to have this joke, which these days is unfortunately not a joke anymore, but I used to say, I'm a gay comedian. If you don't laugh at me, you're a fascist. People always take the piss out of actors and things because they say, oh, lovies, and everybody calls everybody darling or whatever. But actually, when you're involved in a project like that and you're together with people on the road or you're in rehearsal, it is a very intense relationship for a relatively short space of time and a common endeavour in which you're all relying on each other. And that does actually build relationships of terrific strength, actually, even over a relatively short space of time.
1988 was not a good year to be gay in the United Kingdom. A hostile press, a hostile government, and the HIV/AIDS epidemic was at its height. This was the backdrop to the foundation of Stonewall, the gay civil rights organisation. Today's guest was there right at the beginning of it all. Simon Fanshawe, welcome to The Y Word.
Hello.
Hello. It's a very serious intro and very perky hello.
Well, I'll try and be perky. It's hard looking back and remembering sort of, in one sense, just how awful it was, and in the other sense, how much fun we had.
I want to talk to you about that because when I say to young people, hey, it wasn't so long ago that the age of consent was different, gay people couldn't get married, you could be fired for being gay, they don't believe me. And I have to explain, and they look at you completely aghast and you realise that how much life has changed since those days. It's
changed enormously. And also, I made a film about the 1967 Sexual Offences Act, which was incredibly important because the only thing we've got really is visibility. So that enabled us literally to be out, you know, in public in a way that wasn't going to bring down the sanction of the law. But when I was making this film, I went to the cellars, the basement of the town hall in Brighton, where the old jail was. I mean, only 8 years before the time that I had started being a student, men were still being put in prison on the suspicion based on an address book. And that really shocked me. I hadn't quite realised just how close I was to that sort of turning point in history.
I'm sure that when Stonewall was set up, the resistance to it was, well, you know, you've been decriminalised. What on earth have you got to complain about? We're not putting you in prison anymore. Why do you need this new organisation? So why did you?
Well, I think there was something called Section 28, which was the sort of immediate catalyst for this. And Section 28 was part of the Local Government Act. And what it was an attempt to do was to stop local government. And the phrase was promoting homosexual relationships as pretended family relationships. What this was about the right of the Conservative Party, and actually that meant the bulk of the Conservative Party, using lesbians and gays as a stick with which to beat the then very vocal left-wing authorities, which the tabloid press called the loony left authorities. And I think that we were a handy, as we often are, lesbians and gays often are a kind of handy tool with which to say things politically. So if you're on the right, what you do is you go around council estates and you say, well, the council's not mending your windows because they're giving money to the gays. And if you're David Cameron, what you do is you've got the Tory party that's seen as the nasty party. You say, no, we're nice to the gays. And even China a few years back, there was a Chinese actress who retweeted a sermon by a rabbi in New York, which is against gay marriage in America. And she had won the big award, whatever the equivalent of the Chinese Oscar is or whatever. And she was due therefore the next year to present the award. They banned her from presenting the award because of this thing. Now, the Chinese are not known for human rights, but that's quite a cheap way of trying to look liberal. I think what was happening around 1988 and Section 28 was that we were the tool, we weren't necessarily the object. But we said, right, if you're going to treat us like that, if you're going to use us, we're not going to stand for it, actually. So we did, I say we, nobody can remember where this tactic came from or who actually thought it up, but somebody somewhere said, Don't ask them if they agree about homosexuality. That's not the point. The point is they're grouping a group of people together and they're disadvantaging us. So we're going to make this an issue about free speech. So we made it an issue about free speech. And actually that's a way to build quite a broad coalition of people, because people don't, by and large, like other groups of people, being discriminated against and victimised.
I went through it a little bit at the beginning of the introduction, but what would you say the big successes of Stonewall have been?
Well, it set itself a legislative agenda. And we used to joke, we said, well, okay, legislative equality by the year 2000. Well, we weren't so late, were we? Gay marriage, we were about 14 years late or something. So the big triumphs really were, after several attempts, was equalising the age of consent. Ending discrimination in employment and services was very, very important. Ending discrimination in the armed forces was very important. Creating regulations where gays and lesbians would have the opportunity to adopt children, put themselves on the birth certificate. Eventually, civil partnerships, of course, was fundamental, and then, in a sense, marriage was the cherry on the cake. Those were the key things that changed people's lives, because it actually meant that, inheritance law changed. So real changes in people's lives. That was the important thing there. And then there's a whole lot of stuff, of course, that remains, which is that, people still get hit in the face. That's another whole chapter.
I remember the age of consent thing fairly clearly, because I was at the perfect age for that, where it was really important. And I remember getting into a debate with somebody, and they were saying, do you really want, men to be having sex with 16-year-old boys? And I said, well, it's the equality that's important. Maybe we should raise the straight age of consent to 18. I
always used to say exactly that. The issue here is equality. I don't care if the age of consent is 21, 34. I don't care if it's 68 as long as it is for everybody. It wasn't the specifics. It was the much bigger questions that were interesting. So, for instance, if you ask the question, what is the function of an age of consent? Well, that's about empowering people, young people, to say no. It's about young people having the ability to draw a line. Without trivializing it, it's like making a coach on a train a quiet coach. It lays down the law, and it means that you don't use your mobile phone. So that's the first thing. And it means that all kids are treated in the same way, so that they have the opportunity to experience that sexual awakening and experience in the same sort of way. There's a question that was asked the whole time during fostering and adoption and all that kind of stuff. Should gay people be parents? It's a profoundly uninteresting question. If what you are saying is, are gay people going to be good parents? Well, I don't know. Are heterosexual people going to be good parents? I don't know. The data would suggest that there are terrifically good gay parents and terrifically bad ones, and there are terrifically good straight parents and terrifically bad ones. The issue is, how do we support people to be good parents and bring up the next generation, which is a fundamentally important part of society? That's the more interesting question. And I think that's true of all of these questions. There's too few of us for us to be that interesting. The issue is, what are the values we want in the world and in society? That's the more interesting, bigger question.
So these were the things that were sort of bouncing around the table back in 1988. I want to take you back there, Simon, and can you sort of paint a picture for me of that table? You were all sitting around and discussing the beginnings of the Stonewall organisation.
We had a supper a few years back, which was the 25th year or something, whatever it was. So it was me and Ian McKellen and Matthew Parris and Olivette and it's all these people, and we're all sitting around the table. And the hilarious thing was that however many years on it was, we all fell back into exactly the same habits. The meetings I remember were, there was a place called the Drill Hall on Cheney Street, which is just off Tottenham Court Road in central London. I can see us now. I can see a bunch of people sitting in a circle. I can see us trying to think about how we made that into a kind of, how we got a popular support for this issue. That's all I remember us really thinking about. It was like, how can we build the biggest coalition of people around this stuff? And then, of course, in the room was Ian McKellen, for instance. And of course, Ian knew everybody in theatre. So we were good at the theatre of it and doing things that sort of were clever at grabbing people's attention and also their engagement, their amusement. People were enlivened, I think, by the idea of it because they didn't like the fact that we were being treated badly.
Well, you were well known as a comedian at that time. So was that what you brought to the party?
I suppose so. What was peculiar about it was, I mean, nowadays, it's wonderful. I mean, there are gay comics everywhere. Can't move for them. Back in those days, he says, sadly, at 950, it was Julian Clary and me. And it's really hard to remember that was it. The days were dark. We were dealing with AIDS. We were dealing with this kind of victimization and prejudice. People were, homophobic crime was very, very common and so on and so forth. But, there's always a contrast. I mean, I've had a long involvement in various ways with South Africa and anti-apartheid and things. People were astonished that, black people in South Africa celebrated and danced. Well, I mean, you can't spend your entire life cowering in the corner. You've got to celebrate.
Well, the 80s was when comedy did get very political. I mean, consciously political. I mean, I guess Bernard Manning is political in his own way, but it was political sort of more from the left. So did you feel that you were representing?
Well, there was always a real danger in thinking, that comedy was what was going to, really unite the trade union movement, get equal pay for women and stop homophobia and defeat racism. But what was interesting was being in a group of people who had a determination to change the content and the intent of comedy. Those people are the great pioneers. I mean, Alexei Sayle is the granddaddy of it all in Britain. And when I went to America, I went to tour in America in the mid-80s, I really had to find a different way of writing into it because there you were doing comedy clubs and the audiences were, they had never thought about sexual politics or anything like that. That wasn't their bag, They were there for, good old blokey comedy. I used to have this joke, which these days is unfortunately not a joke anymore, but I used to say, I'm a gay comedian. If you don't laugh at me, you're a fascist.
As you can hear, Simon and I are more than capable of spending hours swapping jokes and stories about showbiz. But I thought it would be of more interest to you, dear listener, if we talked a little bit more about how he became this key person of influence at that time. What it was in his background that made him capable of standing up and talking about these issues that were quite taboo, and how he used his celebrity status, because he really was, at the time, very high profile. As he told me, him coming out actually made the newspapers. Front page, no less.
My best moment on the front of the papers was late '89. I ended up on the front page of The Sun. I got asked to do this program which Esther Ranson used to do, and we talked about the publicity and the interviews and stuff, and we decided that it would be sensible, just in the same way that I'd done in comedy, just to sort of drop it into the conversation with the journalist. So not make a big thing of it and whatever. Of course, they made a big thing of it when I said that I was gay. He practically fell off his chair in the restaurant we were in. And the idea that I would admit it. And that, looking back on it, you think, how bizarre. That's strange. Why would I hide it? Anyway, and so I'm on the train and I sit down in the carriage and there's a guy reading the first edition of The Sun opposite me. And on the front page is a picture of me and the headline, "The Day I Told My Folks I Was Gay." So I look at it, I'm absolutely horrified. I lean over to this guy and say, I wonder if I could just borrow your paper. And he looked at me, smiled and said, I think you should. And he gave me his paper. I read the story. It was actually fine. I mean, for the time, it was fine. It was ridiculous. It wasn't a news story, but it was fine. It must have been a really, really short news day. The bit that really annoyed me was folks, like it was the Beverly Hillbillies or something. My parents are not folks. We do not come from rural stock, thank you very much. No straw in our hair. Then I realised, of course, that my dad was dead by this stage, about 5 years, but I realised that my mum, she would have to deal with this in the village that she lived in Wiltshire, which is rather small. So I rang her up early the next morning and I said, now look, here's the thing. I'm doing this programme with Esther. that, did an interview. This is what they've decided to headline. So this is the thing. She said, read me the story. So I read it to her. She goes, well, that seems fine to me. I said, oh, all right. Yeah, well, it seems fine to me too. But I did just want to warn you. She said, thank you very much. Goodbye. So I rang up in the afternoon and I said, how was the day? She said, well, So I went to the post office, she said. I walked into the post office and everybody went very quiet. But I carried on. The experience of the Second World War makes people like my mother, completely undaunted by any kind of experience, sailing down the aisle in the post office, despite the villagers gawping at her because I was on the front page of the Sun. And she was always amazing like that. But when you think back at that, that's the most extraordinary thing, that the very fact of somebody being on a big rated programme and being gay was like a front page news story. It tells you something about what was going on.
You went to boarding school, and so clearly they're not necessarily the Sun's demographic, your family. Did you feel that boarding school was liberating for you to be yourself?
I went to a school called Marlborough College, and it's got quite a liberal sort of background. It's not the richest, it's not the poshest. It's a rather more sort of your middle class professionals. Lots of vicars and army, like my dad was in the army. Lots of people like that. Interesting. The guy who was the headmaster was a quite well-known Labour figure in education. He was called Jack Dancy. He made it co-educational. He abolished compulsory chapel. All these things. I hung around with a group of people, guys, who were just terrific. They were clever, they were argumentative, they were funny, they were theatrical, they were sporty, but they were just engaged. And I was so lucky to meet Tim and David and Adam and all these people. And we used to have the most amazing conversations. And then if you think outside the school what was happening, we listened to Ziggy Stardust. We were aware of Marlon Brando. These were men who were espousing kind of bisexuality, and it was kind of beginning to be Mark Bolan. All these people were kind of around, So, I wasn't exactly sort of under the radar. But I do remember doing a school play, and I played a gay character in it. But I did, very much camp it up, and got a lot of laughs as a result, by the way. I was called a puff in the queue for lunch. And I remember being profoundly exposed. I remember feeling incredibly angry from a defensive point of view. So I clearly knew what was going on, but I was having sex. So I clearly knew that was around. I clearly knew that it was a bit taboo, but it was only kind of half taboo. And in an intellectual, artistic, sort of aesthetic sense, it was actually all kind of out there. But I remember being very defensive and very wounded. I can hear it and see it to this day. And the other thing was I had a fantastic history teacher with whom I'm still very good friends with, him and his wife. He's a remarkable man called Oliver Ramsbottom. I remember saying to Oliver, "You didn't enjoy that, did you?" I said, "I can just tell." Meredith is his wife, said, "Well, the thing is, son, Meredith and I don't think people are funny just because they're homosexual." And I said, "Well, don't be ridiculous. You might as well say mother-in-laws are not funny." Not very long after that, there I was being a radical gay comedian on the alternative cabaret circuit. Things change quickly, don't they?
You seem to be very good at finding groups. You found this group in your school. You then went out into the circuit, and although comedians look like lone wolves, the reality, I think, is that the people that get on with people tend to do well on the comedy circuit. And then you found Stonewall. Do you play well with others, is what I'm saying?
Do I play well with others? You probably have to ask the others to find out that. Look, I think there's a number of things. My father was in the army, and so we moved. And I went to boarding schools from the age of 8. So it meant that when I was at my parents' house, home, I didn't know anybody. So I think when you're in that situation, you do a couple of things. You learn rather quickly, to adapt fast in social situations. So when you're in a situation, you kind of, you make that group quickly. The other thing is that in the places where you do have constancy, you throw your roots down really quickly. So you make those swift groups of friends and the moving groups, and then you throw them down. I think then also that when you're a freelance, and particularly I think starting off in performing, you're very used to doing projects with people. People always take the piss out of actors and things because they say, "Oh, lovies," and everybody calls everybody darling or whatever. But actually, when you're involved in a project like that and you're together with people on the road or you're in rehearsal, it is a very intense relationship for a relatively short space of time and a common endeavour in which you're all relying on each other. And that does actually build relationships of terrific strength, actually, even over a relatively short space of time. I'm good at keeping friends. I make a lot of effort because I get a lot out of it and I put a lot into it. Life is for me is about change. And the only way you can make change is by trying to find common ground with people. And so I'm precisely interested in how people's expression of their difference is the way that you start to find the common ground.
In that case, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to know this is coming from a good place. Okay. We'll see how I word it, and we'll see how you feel at the end of the question, which is that end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, I would say you were in the sort of white heat of fame. The fact you come out becomes the front page of The Sun. If you'd wanted to, I'm sure you could have maintained that kind of profile. What's it like, and why did you maybe take a step away from it?
I think there are two. I've thought about this a lot. I think I got scared of audiences. Not in any dramatic way, but I think that I performed in America with a really lovely comic called Bill Sheft, who eventually became the head writer on Letterman. He stopped performing and he went into writing. I used to watch him work an audience, and I learned so much from that. And and I really enjoyed that. That was the bit I absolutely loved. And Bill said to me one day when I asked him about stopping performing and taking up writing, he said, well, the trouble was I was coming off stage every night thinking, phew, got away with that again. I found that stand-up itself wasn't doing it for me. I didn't understand my relationship with the audience. So I never really found what was my telly medium, and subsequently when I've made documentaries, it's quite obvious that that's my telly medium. That's where I should have gone. I should have gone into making documentaries and things at that sort of early age. I would have told myself to relax, do some therapy, get more comfortable with yourself, try to stop being angry about the fact that you're gay and enjoy the fact that you're gay, and so not use it as a weapon against audiences, but somehow use it as something which was more fun than anger. I didn't see the way forward, whereas I did in radio, and I did when I started writing for the Sunday Times and the Guardian and all that lot. There's something about growing up gay which is very damaging. I don't know whether you read The Velvet Rage, but the central thesis I think is really interesting, and it's this. It's if you grow up gay, you grow up in a context where something about your core is never acknowledged and it's never affirmed, and you have to learn that. You have to go through an arc in order to learn how to be loved. And I think I went through that arc slightly slower than I thought I was going through it. The activism in the 80s and when I was a student, and then subsequently the 80s and so on and so forth, actually in a sense that was a product of unhappiness rather than happiness. I think being out and not thinking about being out and being, in a sense, thrust into the public there and dealing with all that stuff and being gay in a very public way, the whole society around you doesn't affirm the being gay. And I think that produces a lot of anger. And I think that's true of lots of those different minority movements. Change involves understanding difference and not trying to stop the acknowledgement of difference, but using difference in order to try and build bridges and find common ground with people. It's not about being right. It's not about being passionate. It is about hearing and listening.
On that note, we're going to move to my very final question, Simon Fanshawe, which is the dinner party game. It's got to be a business lunch. You can have anyone you like for a business lunch, alive, dead, fictional, real.
I think I've been reading recently, I would like to have lunch with Abraham Lincoln. The way in which he went around about understanding things was to research them to the nth degree. He was a voracious reader and researcher. And what he understood about slavery was its inequity and its utter illogicality. What he understood was that people argued that the slavery was justified by the Constitution, and he also understood that the majority of the population didn't oppose slavery. So what is fascinating about Lincoln are the stages through which he went to reach the 13th Amendment and the abolition of slavery, and the way in which he put together what Doris Kearns Goodwin, the historian, famously called the cabinet of rivals. And if it was somebody who was now, I'd like to meet the person who invented Lego, because I think Lego's just the best thing. And I haven't played with it for about 50 years, but I still think it's the best thing ever.
I'll do my best Kirsty walk, and I will give you Abraham Lincoln, and I'll give you a big box of Lego to play with. Simon Fanshawe. Simon Fanshawe, thank you for being on The Y Word.
Thank you very much indeed for asking me.
And a huge thank you to Simon Fanshawe, one of the founders of Stonewall and a broadcaster. He's got TV shows currently on iPlayer, so do check him out. If you want to get in touch with me or the show, you'll find my LinkedIn profile details down in the show notes. I adore catching up with people there and finding more people to talk to. And if you think you would like to be a guest, or you know somebody who should be, that is also the place to get in touch and let me know. Thank you, as a listener, for giving me your space, giving me your time. I really value it. So let me know, good, bad or indifferent, what you think of the show. I'm all ears, and a little bit of mouth as well, as you can hear. So thanks, Simon, thanks to you, and have a great time till the next time.